I never expected that learning to parallel park would become the most humiliating experience of my life. After commanding aircraft carriers through hostile waters and navigating destroyers through typhoons that would make grown men weep, I thought handling a Honda Civic in downtown traffic would be simple enough. I was wrong about a lot of things that Tuesday morning, but mostly I was wrong about how much respect I thought I'd earned after 35 years of service. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me that at 62 years old, I was sitting in a student driver's seat being lectured about proper mirror adjustment by someone who probably wasn't even born when I was already commanding my first vessel. But that's what civilian life does to you. It strips away everything you've accomplished and reduces you to whatever people can see on the surface. And what they saw was just another nervous older woman who clearly didn't belong behind the wheel of anything more complicated than a shopping cart. The whole mess started 3 weeks earlier when my driver's license expired. In the Navy, I'd had drivers and official vehicles for the better part of 2 decades. When you're responsible for 10,000 sailors and a floating city worth $4 billion, someone else handles the mundane details like parking and traffic laws. But civilian bureaucracy doesn't care about your service record or how many lives you've been responsible for. They care about whether you can execute a 3-point turn without hitting a cone, and apparently, I couldn't prove that without taking their ridiculous test. My brother Marcus had suggested his driving school with the kind of enthusiasm that should have been my first warning. Marcus was 5 years younger than me and had never quite gotten over the fact that his big sister had outranked most of the military officers he'd ever met. He'd started Precision Driving Academy right after I retired, using his background as a police instructor to teach civilians the fundamentals of defensive driving. It was a decent business, but Marcus had always been more interested in impressing the young instructors he hired than maintaining the professional standards I would have expected. That's how I found myself walking into a strip mall classroom on a Tuesday morning, carrying a permit like some 16-year-old who just passed her written test. The irony was devastating. I'd navigated ships through the Strait of Hormuz under hostile fire, coordinated complex naval maneuvers involving dozens of vessels, and managed logistics operations that kept entire battle groups supplied and operational. But none of that mattered now because I needed to prove I could handle a 4-door sedan in a residential neighborhood. The waiting area smelled like stale coffee and teenage anxiety. Plastic chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a counter where 2 young women processed paperwork with the efficiency of people who'd rather be anywhere else. Behind them, inspirational posters showed sports cars and motorcycles with slogans about safety and responsibility. The whole place had the cheerful desperation of a business trying too hard to make something inherently boring seem exciting. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing civilian clothes that wouldn't draw attention or announce my background. Navy blazer, slacks, sensible shoes. Nothing that screamed retired Admiral or suggested I'd spent the last 3 decades making decisions that affected national security. I wanted to blend in, to be just another student learning the rules of civilian driving. Looking back, that was probably my first mistake. Sometimes hiding who you are just makes it easier for people to treat you poorly. The other students were mostly teenagers with their parents, a few middle-aged adults who'd let their licenses lapse, and one man in his 70s who kept muttering about how things were different in his day. I fit somewhere in the awkward middle ground between those categories, old enough to seem out of place, but not old enough to earn the patient tolerance they showed the elderly gentleman. Marcus emerged from his office with the kind of broad smile that meant he was either genuinely happy to see me or performing for his staff. He was dressed in the company uniform, khaki pants and a polo shirt with Precision Driving Academy embroidered on the chest, and moved with the casual authority of someone who owned the place. His hair had gone gray at the temples, but he still carried himself like the patrol officer he'd been before transitioning into civilian instruction. "Sarah," he called out, using my first name in a way that immediately diminished any authority I might have commanded. Ready to get back behind the wheel? The question was innocent enough, but it carried an undercurrent of amusement that suggested he found the whole situation entertaining. His little sister, the big-shot Admiral, reduced to taking driving lessons like a common civilian. I forced a smile and nodded, ignoring the way his staff glanced in our direction with barely concealed curiosity. They'd obviously been told about the connection, probably with enough details to make them think they knew my story. Retired military, let her rank go to her head, never learned proper civilian driving. The narrative was easy enough to construct when you didn't know the full picture. Marcus introduced me to my instructor, a young man named Derek who couldn't have been more than 25. He had the kind of confident swagger that came from being good at something most people struggled with, and the casual disrespect that young men often showed toward older women. His handshake was firm but brief, his eyes already moving past me toward the next appointment on his schedule. "So, you're Marcus's sister," Derek said, his tone carrying just enough surprise to suggest he'd expected someone different. "He mentioned you might need some work on the fundamentals. Don't worry, we get a lot of people who think they know how to drive but never learned proper technique." The assumption in his voice was unmistakable. I was another overconfident amateur who needed to be humbled before real learning could begin. The fact that I'd spent decades making split-second decisions under pressure, coordinating complex operations involving hundreds of people, and maintaining situational awareness in environments where mistakes cost lives, none of that registered as relevant experience. I was just another student who needed to prove she deserved to share the road with competent drivers. We walked out to the practice vehicle, a white Honda Civic with student driver magnets on the sides and dual brake pedals that would allow Derek to take control if my incompetence became dangerous. The car was immaculate, maintained with the kind of attention to detail that suggested the school took its equipment seriously. I appreciated that level of professionalism, even if I couldn't appreciate Derek's attitude. "Before we start," Derek said, settling into the passenger seat with practiced ease, "I want you to adjust your mirrors and seat position. Most people have never been taught proper ergonomics, and it shows in their driving." He spoke with the patience of someone explaining something to a child, each word carefully enunciated as if I might not understand basic concepts without extra effort. I adjusted the mirrors and seat with the precision I'd learned from years of taking command of different vessels, each with its own configuration and requirements. Situational awareness began with understanding your position and capabilities relative to your environment. Derek watched with the kind of attention that suggested he was looking for mistakes to correct, already forming opinions about my competence based on how I handled these preliminary tasks. "Okay," he said, consulting his clipboard. "We'll start with basic vehicle control in the parking lot, then move to residential streets if you demonstrate adequate skill level. Remember, this isn't about speed or showing off. It's about safety and following proper procedures." The lecture continued for several more minutes, covering topics I could have taught myself: defensive positioning, scanning techniques, hazard identification. What Derek couldn't know from looking at me was that I'd spent the last 5 years of my naval career developing training protocols for amphibious assault vehicles. I'd worked with Marines who needed to transition from ship to shore operations, coordinating land-based movement with naval support. I'd studied traffic patterns, vehicular dynamics, and tactical positioning in ways that went far beyond civilian driving requirements. But explaining that would have sounded like bragging, and I'd learned long ago that competence spoke louder than credentials. The first 20 minutes went smoothly enough. I demonstrated proper starting procedures, executed basic maneuvers with the kind of precision that came from understanding mechanical systems and spatial relationships. Derek made notes on his clipboard, occasionally offering suggestions that revealed his limited understanding of advanced driving principles. His advice was technically correct, but elementary, the kind of guidance that worked for nervous teenagers but felt condescending when delivered to someone with my background. The problem started when we moved to the residential streets surrounding the driving school. Derek directed me through a neighborhood of modest homes and tree-lined streets, the kind of area where children played in yards and elderly residents walked small dogs. It was exactly the environment where civilian driving rules made perfect sense, prioritizing caution over efficiency, community safety over individual convenience. I drove with the deliberate care I'd learned from commanding vessels in crowded harbors. Every movement was calculated, every decision based on a comprehensive assessment of potential risks and consequences. When I approached intersections, I checked for pedestrians, cyclists, and vehicles that might not be following traffic laws. When children were visible near the roadside, I reduced speed and increased following distance. When other drivers made questionable decisions, I adjusted my position to minimize the impact of their mistakes. Derek interpreted my careful approach as evidence of incompetence. "You're driving like you're afraid of the car," he said, his voice carrying the kind of impatience that suggested I was wasting his time. "Speed up a little, you're holding up traffic." His observation wasn't entirely wrong. There was indeed a line of cars behind us, but he missed the reason for my cautious pace. What he saw as fear was actually hypervigilance, trained by years of experience where overconfidence killed people. In naval operations, you learned that the most dangerous moments were the ones that seemed routine. Complacency was the enemy of survival, and survival was the enemy of everything that mattered. So you stayed alert, you followed procedures, and you never assumed that because something had worked 100 times before, it would work on the 101st attempt. But Derek had never commanded anything more complex than a Honda Civic, and his experience was limited to teaching nervous teenagers how to pass state driving tests. He couldn't recognize competence when it came in a form he didn't understand, so he defaulted to the assumption that anyone who drove differently than he expected must be doing it wrong. "Let's try parallel parking," Derek said as we approached a section of street with marked spaces. "This is where most people struggle, especially older drivers." The comment about older drivers was delivered with casual thoughtlessness, the kind of ageist assumption that people made without considering how it sounded. I was 62, not 92, and my reflexes were still sharp enough to have passed annual flight physicals until my retirement. But Derek had already categorized me as someone whose age made her inherently less capable. I approached the parallel parking exercise with the same methodical precision I'd brought to every other aspect of the lesson. Naval vessels don't have the luxury of multiple attempts when docking in rough seas or contested waters. You calculate your approach, execute your plan, and adjust for variables in real time. The same principles applied to fitting a Honda Civic between two orange cones, except the stakes were lower and the physics were simpler. The first attempt went perfectly. I positioned the vehicle, checked my mirrors, and backed into the space with smooth, controlled movements. The car fit with room to spare on both ends, properly centered and at the correct distance from the curb. It was textbook execution by any reasonable standard, the kind of performance that should have earned acknowledgement if not praise. Instead, Derek shook his head and made additional notes on his clipboard. "Too slow," he said, his tone suggesting I'd failed some unstated time requirement. "In real-world conditions, you can't take that long to park. Other drivers won't wait for you to be that careful." He gestured for me to try again, this time with more urgency. The second attempt was faster but equally precise. I'd learned to perform complex maneuvers under time pressure, and parallel parking didn't approach the difficulty of bringing a destroyer alongside a supply ship in heavy seas. But Derek found new criticisms. My approach angle was too conservative, my use of mirrors was excessive, my final positioning was unnecessarily precise. Everything I did right became evidence of doing something wrong. By the time we returned to the driving school, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical demands of driving. It was the bone-deep tiredness that came from being constantly judged and found wanting by someone whose opinion shouldn't have mattered, but somehow did. Derek's evaluation was predictably harsh. Adequate basic skills, excessive caution, needs work on confidence and real-world application. Marcus was waiting in the office when we returned, his expression carefully neutral as Derek delivered his assessment. "She's got the fundamentals," Derek reported, speaking about me as if I weren't standing right there. "But she's clearly not comfortable behind the wheel. Probably needs several more sessions before she's ready for the road test." The recommendation came with the kind of professional authority that brooked no argument. "What do you think, Sarah?" Marcus asked, finally acknowledging my presence in the conversation about my own competence. Want to schedule some additional practice time? His tone was carefully neutral, but I caught the hint of amusement in his eyes. This was exactly the outcome he'd expected, his accomplished big sister brought down to earth by the humbling reality of civilian life. I wanted to argue, to explain that Derek's evaluation was based on assumptions and inexperience rather than objective assessment. I wanted to point out that his idea of competent driving was actually a recipe for the kind of accidents that happened when people prioritized speed over safety, confidence over caution. But arguing would have only confirmed their impression that I was a difficult student who couldn't accept constructive criticism. Instead, I nodded and scheduled another lesson for the following week. It seemed easier than fighting a battle I couldn't win, at least not on their terms. Sometimes tactical retreat was the better part of valor, especially when you were gathering intelligence for a future engagement. The drive home gave me time to process what had happened and why it bothered me so much. It wasn't just the criticism or the condescension. I dealt with both throughout my career, especially in the early years when women in naval command were rare enough to draw constant scrutiny. What bothered me was the casual dismissal of everything I'd accomplished, the reduction of 35 years of leadership and expertise to excessive caution and lack of confidence. Derek had no idea that the woman he'd just lectured about proper mirror usage had commanded nuclear-powered aircraft carriers worth more than the gross domestic product of small nations. He didn't know that I'd made decisions under pressure that affected the lives of thousands of people, or that I'd been trusted with responsibilities that would have left him paralyzed with anxiety. To him, I was just another older woman who drove too slowly and needed to be taught the basics by someone who understood real driving. The second lesson went no better than the first. Derek had obviously discussed my case with his colleagues because I noticed other instructors watching our practice sessions with barely concealed amusement. Word had spread that Marcus's sister was struggling with basic driving skills, and my subsequent lessons had become a source of entertainment for the young staff members who'd never seen real responsibility or faced genuine consequences for their decisions. The mockery was subtle but persistent. Whispered comments when they thought I couldn't hear, knowing glances when I made mistakes, the kind of casual cruelty that people inflicted when they thought their target was powerless to respond. They treated me like a joke, a cautionary tale about what happened when people overestimated their abilities and needed to be humbled by reality. What made it worse was that Derek's teaching methods were actively counterproductive. His constant criticism and time pressure were designed to break down confidence rather than build competence. Every suggestion was delivered as a correction of some fundamental error. Every improvement was dismissed as still insufficient. It was the opposite of effective leadership, creating anxiety instead of capability, fear instead of understanding. By the third lesson, I'd reached my breaking point. Not because of the driving. I could handle a Honda Civic with the same precision I'd brought to commanding naval vessels, but because of the constant disrespect and dismissal. Derek spent the entire session lecturing me about the importance of confidence while systematically undermining any confidence I might have developed. His idea of instruction was to point out everything I was doing wrong without explaining how to do it right. We were practicing highway merging when it happened. Derek had been criticizing my approach to on-ramp acceleration, insisting that I needed to match traffic speed more aggressively. "You're driving like you're afraid of the other cars," he said, his voice carrying the kind of exasperated patience that suggested he was dealing with a particularly slow student. "Real driving requires assertiveness. You can't be passive out here." The irony was staggering. This young man who'd never made a decision more consequential than which coffee to order was lecturing me about assertiveness and real-world experience. He had no idea that I'd spent decades making split-second decisions in environments where hesitation meant catastrophe, where real assertiveness meant taking calculated risks with full awareness of the potential consequences. I'd kept quiet through 3 lessons, accepting his criticism and attempting to follow his guidance despite my better judgment. But something about his tone, the casual assumption that he understood concepts like assertiveness and real-world pressure better than I did, finally pushed me past my limit. The woman who'd commanded respect from admirals and heads of state wasn't going to sit quietly while some civilian instructor questioned her understanding of decisive action. "You want to see assertiveness?" I asked, my voice carrying just enough edge to suggest that his next response would determine how the rest of this conversation went. "You want to see real-world driving?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with the promise of something Derek wasn't prepared to handle. But I didn't get the chance to show him what real assertiveness looked like, because just as I was about to demonstrate exactly how much I understood about vehicle dynamics and tactical positioning, another instructor's voice crackled through Derek's radio with a message that would change everything. "Derek, bring your student back to base immediately," the voice said, tight with something that sounded like controlled panic. "We have a situation that requires immediate attention." The professional calm in the transmission was the kind that meant someone had made a discovery that changed all the rules of engagement. And as we turned back toward the driving school, I had no idea that in 15 minutes, everyone who'd spent 3 weeks questioning my competence was about to learn exactly who they'd been mocking. The drive back to the school felt different, charged with an energy that hadn't been there during our practice sessions. Derek kept glancing at his radio as if expecting another transmission, his previous confidence replaced by something that looked suspiciously like nervousness. The casual authority he'd wielded during our lessons seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind a young man who suddenly wasn't sure he was in control of the situation. When we pulled into the parking lot, I immediately noticed the differences. There were more vehicles than usual, several official-looking sedans with government plates, a black SUV with tinted windows, and what appeared to be a news van from the local television station. People in business suits were walking purposefully between the vehicles, speaking into phones with the kind of urgency that suggested something significant was happening. Marcus stood near the entrance to the school, but he wasn't alone. Next to him was a woman in a navy dress uniform, her bearing unmistakably military even from a distance. She wore the insignia of a lieutenant commander, and the way she carried herself suggested she was accustomed to being taken seriously when she spoke. As we approached, I could see that Marcus's face had gone pale, and his usual easy confidence had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like panic. Derek parked the Honda and turned to me with an expression I'd never seen during our previous lessons. The condescending patience was gone, replaced by confusion and what might have been the beginning of genuine concern. "Something's wrong," he said, stating the obvious with the kind of helpful observation that revealed how little he understood about reading situations under pressure.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I climbed out of the passenger seat, my movements deliberate and controlled despite the questions racing through my mind. Whatever was happening here involved the Navy, involved enough official attention to bring news crews, and had somehow connected to my presence at this small civilian driving school. The possibilities were limited, and none of them were particularly good for maintaining the low profile I'd been trying to preserve. The lieutenant commander noticed my approach and moved toward us with the purposeful stride of someone who had important business to conduct. Her eyes fixed on me with the kind of recognition that meant my attempts at anonymity had just come to an abrupt end. Behind her, I could see other uniformed personnel, their presence lending weight to whatever announcement was about to unfold. "Admiral Anderson," the lieutenant commander said, her voice carrying across the parking lot with crisp authority. The title hung in the air like a physical presence, and I watched as Derek's face went through a series of expressions that would have been amusing under different circumstances. Confusion gave way to disbelief, disbelief to shock, and shock to something that looked remarkably like terror. "Lieutenant Commander Phillips," I replied, recognizing her from briefings we'd attended during my final years of active duty. Sarah Phillips was competent, professional, and not given to dramatic gestures without serious cause. Her presence here meant this situation was official, significant, and about to become very complicated for everyone involved. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you immediately," Phillips continued, her tone suggesting that this conversation couldn't wait for more convenient circumstances. There's been a development regarding the Richardson inquiry, and your expertise is required for immediate consultation. She glanced meaningfully at the assembled crowd, the news crew, and the growing number of onlookers who'd been drawn by the unusual activity. The Richardson inquiry. I'd been following that investigation peripherally since my retirement, a complex case involving allegations of misconduct in naval procurement that had implications reaching into the highest levels of command. If they needed my expertise urgently enough to track me down at a civilian driving school, it meant someone had discovered connections that required immediate attention from someone with my background and security clearance. But the professional crisis would have to wait, because Derek was staring at me with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been turned upside down. "Admiral?" he repeated, his voice cracking slightly on the word. "You're an admiral?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper, as if speaking it too loudly might make the terrible reality even more real. Marcus approached us with the careful movements of someone walking through a minefield. His face had gone from pale to ashen, and I could see him running through every interaction we'd had over the past 3 weeks, recalculating every assumption he'd made about his sister's competence and qualifications. "Sarah," he said, his voice strained, "they've been here for 20 minutes asking questions about you, about your background, about why you were taking driving lessons." The implications were starting to cascade through the small crowd that had gathered. Other instructors had emerged from the building, drawn by the unusual activity and the presence of military personnel. I could see them pointing, whispering, their conversations growing more animated as they began to piece together the significance of what they were witnessing. Philip stepped closer, lowering her voice to a level that wouldn't carry to the growing audience. "Ma'am, I apologize for the public nature of this contact, but the situation requires immediate consultation with someone of your expertise and clearance level. We've discovered financial irregularities that connect to operations you oversaw during your final deployment, and we need your analysis of the procurement patterns before the investigation moves forward." I nodded, understanding the urgency, even as I recognized that my carefully maintained civilian anonymity was about to become a casualty of national security requirements. "I'll need to gather some materials from my apartment," I said, already shifting into the professional mindset that had guided me through 3 decades of naval service. "How much time do we have?" "The briefing is scheduled for 1400 hours, Phillips replied, checking her watch with practiced efficiency. "We have a helicopter standing by for transport to Norfolk, but we'll need to leave within the hour." She glanced at Derek, who was still standing nearby looking like he'd been struck by lightning, then back to me. "Ma'am, is there anything here that requires immediate attention before we depart?" The question was politely phrased, but the underlying message was clear. Whatever civilian business I'd been conducting was now secondary to matters of national security, and everyone present needed to understand that reality. I looked around at the faces surrounding us, Marcus with his mixture of shock and dawning comprehension, Derek with his growing horror at the magnitude of his mistake, the other instructors beginning to realize that they'd been witnessing something far more significant than a routine driving lesson. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying the kind of authority I'd learned to project when addressing rooms full of senior officers, "there are a few things that need to be clarified before I leave." I turned to Derek, who seemed to shrink under my direct gaze. "Young man, I believe you have some observations about my driving competence that you'd like to share with Lieutenant Commander Phillips." Derek's mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound. The confident instructor who'd spent 3 weeks lecturing me about proper driving technique had been replaced by someone who looked like he wanted to disappear into the asphalt. "Admiral, I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "That's precisely the problem," I said, my tone remaining conversational despite the steel underneath. "You didn't know, but you assumed you did. You saw an older woman taking driving lessons and concluded that she must be incompetent, despite evidence to the contrary." I gestured toward Phillips and the other military personnel.
These officers need to understand why someone with my background might appear to be struggling with basic civilian driving skills. Phillips looked between Derek and me with the sharp intelligence that had made her successful in naval intelligence. "Ma'am, if there's been some kind of training issue, we should address it immediately. Your security clearance and operational knowledge make you a valuable asset, and any concerns about your capabilities need to be resolved. The moment was perfect in its irony. Derek, who'd spent weeks questioning my competence, was now being asked to explain his assessment to a naval intelligence officer who understood exactly what my background represented. I could see him trying to formulate an explanation that wouldn't make him look like a complete fool. But there was no way to describe his teaching methods that wouldn't reveal the fundamental flaws in his approach. "Lieutenant Commander," I said, deciding to spare Derek further immediate humiliation. "This gentleman has been providing me with civilian driving instruction for the past 3 weeks. His assessment has been that my driving style is excessively cautious, lacking in confidence, and unsuitable for real-world conditions." I paused, letting the implications sink in. "I'd like you to consider whether those observations are consistent with someone who has successfully commanded nuclear-powered aircraft carriers in hostile waters." Phillips's expression shifted subtly, the kind of change that happened when an intelligence officer recognized a pattern that didn't make sense. "Ma'am, are you suggesting that your instructor was unaware of your military background?" she asked, her tone carrying just enough surprise to indicate that she found this difficult to believe. "Completely unaware," I confirmed. "I chose not to disclose my service record because I wanted to be treated like any other civilian student. Unfortunately, that approach provided some illuminating insights into how this establishment approaches instruction and evaluation." I looked at Marcus, who was still standing nearby looking like he wished he could be anywhere else in the world. "Perhaps my brother would like to explain the teaching philosophy that led to this situation." Marcus cleared his throat nervously, his face flushed with embarrassment and what might have been growing anger at his staff. "Sarah, I had no idea they were treating you that way. If I'd known." He trailed off, realizing that claiming ignorance wasn't going to improve his position when his sister had just been revealed to be one of the most senior naval officers in recent history. "You had no idea because you didn't ask," I said, my voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded severe disciplinary action. "You assumed that because I needed to take civilian driving lessons, I must be incompetent behind the wheel. You allowed your staff to treat me with disrespect because you found it amusing that your accomplished sister was struggling with something as mundane as parallel parking." The truth of the accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Marcus had indeed found the situation entertaining, had enjoyed seeing his high-achieving sister brought down to earth by civilian bureaucracy. His smirk during Derek's evaluations, his casual dismissal of my concerns, his willingness to let his staff treat me like an incompetent amateur, all of it had been motivated by sibling rivalry and the satisfaction of seeing me fail at something he considered within his area of expertise. Phillips was taking notes now, her expression suggesting that she was beginning to understand the full scope of what had transpired. "Ma'am, for the record, can you describe the specific nature of the instruction you received and the evaluation methods that were used?" The question was posed with professional neutrality, but I could hear the underlying concern that someone with my security clearance and operational background had been subjected to potentially compromised training. "The instruction focused primarily on speed rather than safety," I began, organizing my thoughts with the precision I'd learned from decades of military briefings. "The evaluations penalized defensive positioning, comprehensive threat assessment, and adherence to safety protocols in favor of aggressive acceleration and risk-taking behavior that would be inappropriate in tactical environments." I paused, glancing at Derek, who was looking increasingly pale. The instructor repeatedly criticized my situational awareness and systematic approach to vehicle operation as evidence of incompetence rather than proper training. The irony was becoming more apparent to everyone present. Derek had been criticizing me for applying military-grade operational procedures to civilian driving, treating sophisticated tactical thinking as evidence of civilian incompetence. He'd been teaching aggressive driving techniques to someone whose understanding of vehicle dynamics far exceeded his own, then dismissing her careful methodology as proof that she didn't understand real-world driving. Phillips finished her notes and looked up with the kind of expression that suggested she was beginning to see the full scope of what had transpired. "Ma'am, for the record, can you describe the specific nature of the instruction you received and the evaluation methods that were used?" The question was posed with professional neutrality, but I could hear the underlying concern that someone with my security clearance and operational background had been subjected to potentially compromised training. "The instruction focused primarily on speed rather than safety," I began, organizing my thoughts with the precision I'd learned from decades of military briefings. "The evaluations penalized defensive positioning, comprehensive threat assessment, and adherence to safety protocols in favor of aggressive acceleration and risk-taking behavior that would be inappropriate in tactical environments." I paused, glancing at Derek, who was looking increasingly pale. "The instructor repeatedly criticized my situational awareness and systematic approach to vehicle operation as evidence of incompetence rather than proper training." The irony was becoming more apparent to everyone present. Derek had been criticizing me for applying military-grade operational procedures to civilian driving, treating sophisticated tactical thinking as evidence of civilian incompetence. He'd been teaching aggressive driving techniques to someone whose understanding of vehicle dynamics and threat assessment far exceeded his own, then dismissing her careful methodology as proof that she didn't understand real-world driving. Phillips finished her notes and looked up with the kind of expression that suggested she was beginning to see the broader implications of what had transpired. "Admiral, given your background in amphibious operations and tactical vehicle coordination, would you say that this instruction was consistent with proper defensive driving principles?" "Absolutely not," I replied without hesitation. "The methods used here prioritize speed and aggression over safety and situational awareness. The evaluation criteria reward exactly the kind of risk-taking behavior that leads to casualties in operational environments." I gestured toward the driving school building. "If these techniques were applied to military vehicle operations, the result would be preventable accidents and mission failures." The assessment hit Derek like a physical blow. For 3 weeks, he'd been lecturing me about proper driving technique, confident that his civilian instructor credentials gave him authority over someone he perceived as an incompetent amateur. Now he was learning that his methods were not only wrong, but potentially dangerous when evaluated by someone with actual expertise in vehicle operations under pressure. More people had gathered during our conversation, drawn by the presence of military personnel and the growing realization that something significant was happening. I could see other students and their parents pointing and whispering, trying to understand why their quiet driving school had suddenly become the center of official attention. The news crew was setting up equipment, obviously hoping to capture whatever story was developing. Marcus stepped forward, his face showing the strain of trying to manage a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. "Sarah, maybe we should discuss this privately," he suggested, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "I'm sure we can resolve any misunderstanding without—" He gestured vaguely at Phillips and the other official personnel. "There's no misunderstanding," I said, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Your staff has spent 3 weeks treating me with disrespect and providing substandard instruction based on assumptions about my competence. The only question now is whether you're going to address those systemic problems or continue pretending they don't exist."
Phillips closed her notebook and stepped forward, her bearing suggesting that the informal questioning was about to transition into something more official. "Admiral Anderson, we need to depart for Norfolk within 30 minutes to maintain our briefing schedule. However, I believe this situation requires documentation for the record, particularly given the security implications of your presence here." She turned to Marcus with the kind of professional courtesy that carried an underlying threat. "Sir, I'll need to conduct a brief interview with your staff regarding their interaction with Admiral Anderson. Standard security protocol requires us to document any situations where cleared personnel might have been subjected to inappropriate treatment or potential compromise."
The word compromise sent a visible shock through Marcus and Derek. The implications were suddenly much more serious than embarrassment or poor customer service. If my treatment here could be interpreted as security relevant, it meant potential investigations, official reports, and the kind of attention that small businesses couldn't survive. Derek finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "Admiral Anderson, I had no idea about your background. If I'd known who you were, I never would have." He stopped, realizing that finishing the sentence would only make things worse. If he wouldn't have treated me poorly had he known my rank, it meant his poor treatment was based on assumptions about my worth as a person. "That's exactly the problem," I said, echoing my earlier observation. "Your respect was conditional on knowing my rank and background. You treated me poorly because you assumed I was powerless to respond, not because of any genuine assessment of my abilities." I looked around at the gathered crowd, making sure my words carried to everyone present. Real professionalism means treating every customer with dignity and respect, regardless of what you think you know about their background. Phillips checked her watch again, clearly calculating the time remaining before our departure deadline. "Admiral, I'm afraid we need to begin our movement to the helicopter. Can you be ready to leave in 15 minutes? The question was politely phrased, but the underlying urgency was clear. "Affirmative," I replied, already shifting back into military mode. "Lieutenant Commander, I'll need 5 minutes to collect some materials from my vehicle, then I'll be ready for transport." I turned back to Marcus, my expression carrying the weight of 35 years of command authority. "We'll continue this conversation when I return, and you'll have that time to decide how you want to address the systemic problems your school has demonstrated." As I walked toward my car, I could hear the murmur of conversation behind me growing more animated. Word was spreading through the crowd about what they'd just witnessed, and I could imagine the speculation and shock as people realized they'd been watching a decorated admiral being treated like an incompetent amateur by civilian driving instructors. Derek stood frozen near the practice vehicle, his face cycling through expressions of shock, horror, and dawning comprehension of just how badly he'd misjudged the situation. Marcus was already moving toward the building, probably hoping to brief his staff before Phillips began her official interviews. And Phillips herself was coordinating with her team, preparing for whatever revelations might emerge from a more detailed investigation of my treatment here. The helicopter was already visible on the horizon, approaching with the distinctive sound of military rotors cutting through civilian airspace. In a few minutes, I would be back in my element, applying my expertise to matters of national security and operational significance. But first, there were some accounts to settle and some lessons to teach about the difference between respect and condescension. Because sometimes the most important battles weren't fought in hostile waters or contested airspace. Sometimes they were fought in parking lots and civilian businesses, where the simple act of treating people with dignity became a measure of character that revealed more about a person than any official evaluation ever could. And everyone who had spent 3 weeks questioning my competence was about to learn that lesson in ways they would never forget. The helicopter ride to Norfolk gave me time to compartmentalize what had happened at the driving school and focus on the crisis that required my immediate attention. The Richardson inquiry had indeed uncovered financial irregularities that connected to procurement decisions I'd overseen during my final deployment, and the next 4 hours were spent in briefing rooms analyzing transaction patterns and identifying potential security breaches that could compromise ongoing operations. By the time I returned to civilian life that evening, my phone was buzzing with missed calls and text messages. Word had spread beyond the driving school parking lot, accelerated by social media and local news coverage of the unusual scene. The story had taken on a life of its own, with various versions circulating about the decorated admiral who'd been taking driving lessons and the dramatic revelation of her identity. I drove back to the school the next morning, curious to see how the overnight news cycle had affected the atmosphere. The parking lot was busier than usual, with several news vans and what appeared to be a steady stream of visitors who seemed more interested in looking around than actually enrolling in driving courses. A handwritten sign on the front door read, "Temporarily closed for staff training," which suggested that Marcus was taking the situation more seriously than I'd expected. Through the windows, I could see lights on in the main office and several figures moving around inside. When I knocked on the door, Marcus himself answered, his appearance suggesting he'd spent a sleepless night dealing with the aftermath of yesterday's events. His eyes were bloodshot, his usually neat appearance disheveled, and his expression carried the weight of someone who'd discovered that his problems were larger than he'd initially realized. "Sarah," he said, opening the door with the careful movements of someone expecting additional bad news. "Thank you for coming back. We need to talk." His tone was subdued, lacking the casual confidence that had characterized our previous interactions. The brother who'd been amused by my struggles with civilian driving had been replaced by a business owner facing the potential collapse of his professional reputation. Inside, the school looked different. The cheerful posters about safe driving and defensive techniques seemed almost mocking now, given what had transpired. Derek was sitting at one of the student desks, his head in his hands, while two other instructors I recognized from previous visits stood near the counter looking uncomfortable. The easy camaraderie that had characterized the staff's interactions was gone, replaced by the tense atmosphere of people trying to figure out how to move forward from a catastrophic mistake. "Before we discuss anything else," Marcus said, his voice formal in a way that suggested he'd been practicing this conversation, "I want to apologize. Not just for Derek's behavior, but for my own. I knew who you were, knew what you'd accomplished, and I let my personal feelings affect how I allowed you to be treated here." He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. "I was jealous of your success, and I let that jealousy blind me to what was happening under my own roof." The admission was more honest than I'd expected, and it carried the weight of genuine remorse rather than damage control. Marcus had always struggled with being the younger sibling of someone whose achievements overshadowed his own, but I hadn't realized how deeply that resentment had affected his judgment. His willingness to acknowledge those feelings publicly, in front of his staff, suggested that yesterday's revelation had forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. Derek looked up from his hands, his face pale and drawn. "Admiral Anderson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've been awake all night thinking about everything I said to you, everything I criticized you for. When I found out who you really are, what you've accomplished." He stopped, seeming to struggle with how to express the magnitude of his mistake. "I've been teaching defensive driving for 3 years, and I completely failed to recognize actual defensive thinking when I saw it." The young man who'd spent weeks lecturing me about confidence and real-world driving had been replaced by someone who understood, perhaps for the first time, the difference between competence and arrogance. His evaluation methods, his teaching techniques, his casual dismissal of my careful approach to vehicle operation, all of it looked different when viewed through the lens of actual expertise rather than civilian assumptions about what constituted good driving. "What bothers me most," Derek continued, his voice gaining strength as he worked through his thoughts, "is that everything you were doing was right. The way you checked your mirrors, the way you positioned yourself in traffic, the way you anticipated potential problems, that was exactly what defensive driving is supposed to look like. But I was so focused on speed and aggression that I mistook competence for incompetence." I sat down across from him, recognizing the genuine distress in his voice and the learning opportunity that had emerged from this difficult situation. "Derek, can you tell me what you think you were actually teaching during our lessons?" The question wasn't meant to be punitive, but rather to help him understand the fundamental flaws in his approach. He considered the question carefully, his expression showing the kind of serious thought that had been absent during our previous interactions. "I was teaching people to drive like civilians who were in a hurry," he said slowly. "I was rewarding speed over safety, confidence over caution. I was training people to take risks because I thought that's what real-world driving required." He paused, the implications of his words sinking in. "But real-world driving for you meant life and death decisions, didn't it? When you were commanding vessels, moving personnel, coordinating operations, there was no room for the kind of mistakes I was encouraging." The insight was profound and accurate. Derek was beginning to understand that his civilian instructor perspective had limited his ability to recognize superior operational thinking when he encountered it. His teaching methods were designed for people who needed to pass basic driving tests, not for someone whose understanding of vehicle dynamics and threat assessment had been refined by decades of military experience. "That's exactly right," I confirmed. "When you criticized my mirror usage as excessive, you were actually criticizing systematic threat assessment. When you complained about my cautious speed, you were questioning tactical positioning. When you pushed for more aggressive acceleration, you were advocating for exactly the kind of risk-taking that gets people killed in high-stakes situations." Marcus had been listening to this exchange with growing comprehension of just how badly his school had failed in its basic mission. "Sarah, I'm beginning to understand that we weren't just providing poor customer service, we were actively teaching bad habits to someone whose expertise far exceeded our own." He looked around at his staff, his expression showing the weight of leadership responsibility he'd been avoiding. "The question is, how do we fix this, not just with you, but systemically?" The question showed genuine commitment to improvement rather than just damage control, and it offered an opportunity to turn this crisis into something constructive. "The first step is understanding that driving competence isn't just about following traffic laws or passing tests," I said. "Real driving competence means understanding that every time you get behind the wheel, you're operating a potentially lethal piece of equipment in a complex environment with multiple variables and unpredictable factors." Derek was taking notes now, his entire approach transformed from the casual authority he'd displayed during our lessons to the focused attention of someone genuinely trying to learn. "So, when you were driving defensively, positioning yourself to respond to potential threats, maintaining situational awareness, that wasn't overcautiousness. That was proper operational procedure." "Exactly," I replied. "In military operations, we call it defensive positioning and threat mitigation. In civilian driving, you might call it anticipating problems and maintaining escape routes. The principles are the same, but most civilian instruction doesn't recognize the connection between tactical thinking and safe driving." One of the other instructors, a woman named Jessica who'd been quietly observing our conversation, stepped forward with a question. "Admiral Anderson, if you were designing a driving curriculum based on military principles, what would it look like? How would you teach people to think about vehicle operation the way you do?" The question showed genuine interest in learning rather than just managing the current crisis, and it suggested that the staff was beginning to understand the opportunity for real improvement that had emerged from this difficult situation. "It would start with understanding that driving is a team activity," I said, warming to the subject. "Every other driver on the road is either an ally helping maintain traffic flow and safety, or a potential threat whose actions you need to anticipate and respond to appropriately." Over the next hour, I outlined the fundamental principles that had guided my approach to vehicle operation throughout my military career. Situational awareness meant constantly scanning for threats, opportunities, and changes in the tactical environment. Defensive positioning meant maintaining the ability to respond to unexpected developments without compromising your mission objectives. "Exactly," I replied. "In military operations, we call it defensive positioning and threat mitigation. In civilian driving, you might call it anticipating problems and maintaining escape routes. The principles are the same, but most civilian instruction doesn't recognize the connection between tactical thinking and safe driving." One of the other instructors, a woman named Jessica who'd been quietly observing our conversation, stepped forward with a question. "Admiral Anderson, if you were designing a driving curriculum based on military principles, what would it look like? How would you teach people to think about vehicle operation the way you do?" The question showed genuine interest in learning rather than just managing the current crisis, and it suggested that the staff was beginning to understand the opportunity for real improvement that had emerged from this difficult situation. "It would start with understanding that driving is a team activity," I said, warming to the subject. "Every other driver on the road is either an ally helping maintain traffic flow and safety, or a potential threat whose actions you need to anticipate and respond to appropriately." Over the next hour, I outlined the fundamental principles that had guided my approach to vehicle operation throughout my military career.
Situational awareness meant constantly scanning for threats, opportunities, and changes in the tactical environment. Defensive positioning meant maintaining the ability to respond to unexpected developments without compromising your mission objectives.
Risk assessment meant understanding the difference between acceptable tactical risks and unnecessary exposure to danger. Derek and the other instructors listened with the intensity of people discovering that everything they thought they knew about their profession was incomplete. Their questions showed genuine engagement with concepts they'd never considered, and their growing understanding of how military operational principles applied to civilian driving revealed the depth of expertise they'd been missing. The most important thing to understand, I concluded, is that real confidence behind the wheel comes from competence, not aggression. Someone who truly understands vehicle dynamics and threat assessment doesn't need to prove their abilities through risky behavior. They demonstrate their skills through consistent, safe, effective operation under varying conditions. Marcus had been quiet during most of this impromptu training session, but now he spoke up with a question that got to the heart of his business concerns. "Sarah, would you be willing to help us redesign our curriculum, not just to fix what went wrong, but to actually improve what we're teaching?" The request was genuine, carrying none of the casual presumption that had characterized his earlier interactions with me. The offer was intriguing, and it represented an opportunity to apply military training principles to civilian instruction in a way that could benefit far more people than just the students at this particular school. "I'd consider it," I said, "but only if you're committed to real change, not just cosmetic improvements designed to manage the current publicity situation." "I am," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Yesterday taught me that I don't know as much about this business as I thought I did. If there's a better way to teach people to drive safely, I want to learn it. If there are principles I've been missing, I want to understand them. And if I've been letting my staff develop bad habits, I want to fix that before we make any more mistakes." Derek raised his hand tentatively, like a student asking permission to speak. "Admiral, would you be willing to let me retake your evaluation? Not because I think the original assessment was wrong, but because I want to learn how to recognize competence when I see it. I want to understand what I was missing during our original lessons." The request showed genuine humility and a desire to learn that had been completely absent during our previous interactions. The young man who'd been so confident in his ability to teach me proper driving technique was now asking for the opportunity to discover what real expertise looked like when properly evaluated. "I think that could be arranged," I said, "but only if you're committed to real change, not just cosmetic improvements designed to manage the current publicity situation." "I am," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Yesterday taught me that I don't know as much about this business as I thought I did. If there's a better way to teach people to drive safely, I want to learn it. If there are principles I've been missing, I want to understand them. And if I've been letting my staff develop bad habits, I want to fix that before we make any more mistakes." Derek raised his hand tentatively, like a student asking permission to speak. "Admiral, would you be willing to let me retake your evaluation? Not because I think the original assessment was wrong, but because I want to learn how to recognize competence when I see it. I want to understand what I was missing during our original lessons." The request showed genuine humility and a desire to learn that had been completely absent during our previous interactions. The young man who'd been so confident in his ability to teach me proper driving technique was now asking for the opportunity to discover what real expertise looked like when properly evaluated. "I think that could be arranged," I said, "but this time, instead of you evaluating me, we'll do it as a collaborative assessment. You'll explain your observations, I'll explain my decision-making process, and we'll both learn something about the difference between civilian and military approaches to vehicle operation." The idea energized the entire staff in a way that suggested they were beginning to see this crisis as an opportunity for professional development rather than just a problem to be managed. Jessica volunteered to observe the session so she could apply the insights to her own teaching methods. The other instructors began discussing how they might modify their evaluation criteria to recognize defensive thinking rather than penalizing it. We spent the rest of the morning developing a framework for what Marcus had decided to call tactical defensive driving, a curriculum that would incorporate military operational principles into civilian driver education. The approach would emphasize situational awareness, threat assessment, defensive positioning, and risk mitigation, concepts that had obvious applications to safe driving but were rarely taught explicitly in traditional driver education programs. Derek volunteered to be the first instructor trained in the new methodology, acknowledging that his experience with me had revealed fundamental gaps in his understanding of what constituted competent vehicle operation. His willingness to essentially start over with his instructor training showed a level of professional humility that was refreshing and encouraging. The collaborative assessment session that afternoon was unlike anything that had happened during my original lessons. Instead of Derek lecturing me about proper technique while I demonstrated skills he didn't recognize, we worked together to analyze each decision I made and understand the reasoning behind my approach to various driving challenges. When I checked my mirrors every few seconds, Derek now understood that I was maintaining situational awareness rather than showing excessive caution. When I positioned myself to maintain escape routes in traffic, he recognized tactical positioning rather than indecisiveness. When I adjusted my speed based on variables he hadn't even noticed, he began to appreciate the complexity of real-time threat assessment in a dynamic environment. "This is completely different," Derek said as we concluded the session. "During our original lessons, I was seeing everything you did through the lens of civilian driving instruction, and I was missing the sophistication of what you were actually doing. It's like I was criticizing a symphony for not sounding like a pop song." The analogy was surprisingly apt, and it captured the fundamental problem that had led to our original difficulties. Derek had been applying civilian evaluation criteria to military-grade operational thinking, then concluding that my superior methodology was evidence of incompetence rather than expertise. Word of the school's transformation began spreading through the local community even before we'd finished developing the new curriculum. Veterans who'd heard about the original incident started visiting to see what changes were being implemented. Local law enforcement officers expressed interest in the tactical driving concepts for their own training programs. Even civilian drivers who'd never served in the military began asking about courses that would teach them to think more strategically about vehicle operation. Marcus found himself managing a level of interest and respect that his school had never previously commanded. The crisis that had threatened to destroy his business was becoming the foundation for a completely new approach to driver education, one that promised to set his school apart from every other civilian driving program in the region. 6 months later, I was standing in the same parking lot where Derek had once questioned my competence, watching him conduct a training session for new instructors based on the principles we'd developed together. His teaching style had been completely transformed, emphasizing understanding over compliance, strategic thinking over mechanical technique. The school had expanded to offer specialized courses for emergency responders, security personnel, and anyone whose job required advanced vehicle operation skills. The tactical defensive driving program had attracted attention from other driving schools, and Marcus was fielding requests to franchise the methodology to instructors across the country. Most importantly, the culture of the school had fundamentally changed. Students were treated with respect, regardless of their age, background, or apparent skill level. Instructors were trained to recognize competence in all its forms, not just the narrow version they'd been taught to expect. And everyone who walked through the door was given the opportunity to demonstrate their abilities before being judged on their potential. Derek had become one of the most sought-after instructors in the program, not despite his experience with me, but because of it. His willingness to admit error, learn from mistakes, and completely revise his approach to instruction had made him uniquely qualified to teach others about the importance of recognizing expertise in unexpected forms. You know what I learned from all this?
Derek asked me as we watched his latest group of students practice the systematic observation techniques we'd incorporated into the curriculum. I learned that real teaching isn't about showing students how much you know. It's about recognizing how much they might know that you haven't discovered yet. The insight represented a complete reversal of the approach he'd taken during our original lessons, and it had made him a far better instructor than he'd ever been when he thought his job was to correct other people's inadequacies rather than discover their hidden strengths. As I drove home that evening, using the same careful, systematic approach that had once been criticized as evidence of incompetence, I reflected on how much had changed since that first humiliating lesson. The crisis that had threatened to embarrass both me and my brother had become the catalyst for improvements that would benefit thousands of future drivers. Sometimes the most important lessons weren't learned in classrooms or training facilities, but in parking lots and civilian businesses where the simple act of treating people with respect became the foundation for excellence that exceeded everyone's expectations. As I drove home that evening, using the same careful, systematic approach that had once been criticized as evidence of incompetence, I reflected on how much it changed since that first humiliating lesson. The crisis that had threatened to embarrass both me and my brother had become the catalyst for improvements that would benefit thousands of future drivers. Sometimes the most important lessons weren't learned in classrooms or training facilities, but in parking lots and civilian businesses where the simple act of treating people with respect became the foundation for excellence that exceeded everyone's expectations. And sometimes the best teachers were the ones who'd learned the hard way that competence came in many forms, some of which looked nothing like what they'd been trained to recognize. The driving school that had once mocked my skills had become a place where expertise was celebrated regardless of its source, where defensive thinking was valued over aggressive display, and where every student was given the opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities before being judged on their limitations. It was exactly the kind of transformation that happened when good people were given the chance to learn from their mistakes and apply those lessons to become better than they'd ever imagined possible. 3 years later, I found myself standing behind a podium at the National Association of Driving Instructors annual conference, looking out at an audience of educators who'd come to learn about the revolutionary approach that had emerged from what everyone now called the Admiral Anderson incident. The irony wasn't lost on me that a humiliating experience at my brother's driving school had evolved into a nationally recognized methodology for improving driver education. The presentation I was delivering focused on the fundamental principle that had transformed Marcus's school and dozens of others across the country. Respect-based assessment, as we'd come to call it, started with the assumption that every student possessed valuable knowledge and experience that instructors needed to discover rather than dismiss. It was a simple concept that had profound implications for how driving education was conducted. In the audience, I could see Derek sitting in the front row, taking notes with the same intensity he'd once applied to criticizing my mirror usage. He'd become something of a celebrity in driver education circles, not for his original teaching methods, but for his willingness to completely reimagine his approach based on a single transformative experience. His story of learning to recognize expertise in unexpected forms had become a case study taught at instructor training programs nationwide. The statistics we'd compiled over the 3 years since implementing the new methodology were compelling enough to convince even the most skeptical traditionalists. Student satisfaction scores had increased by 40%. Accident rates among graduates had dropped by 60%. Most significantly, the number of students who completed their training with genuine confidence rather than mere compliance had nearly doubled. But the real measure of success wasn't found in statistics or conference presentations. It was found in stories like the one Marcus had shared with me just last week about Mrs. Chen, an 80-year-old grandmother who'd been afraid to drive for 40 years until she encountered instructors trained to recognize wisdom rather than weakness. Or the teenage student with autism whose methodical approach to vehicle operation had been celebrated rather than criticized as obsessive behavior. The transformation had spread far beyond driving education. Other service industries had begun adopting similar principles, recognizing that their assumptions about customer competence were often limiting their ability to provide effective assistance.
The local bank had retrained their staff after realizing they'd been treating elderly customers like technological incompetence rather than people with decades of financial wisdom. The hardware store had discovered that asking customers about their project goals rather than assuming ignorance led to better outcomes for everyone involved. Derek approached me after the presentation, his expression carrying the thoughtful seriousness that had replaced his earlier arrogance. "Admiral, I wanted you to know that I've been accepted into the Naval Reserve Officer Candidate Program," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and nervousness. "I know it sounds crazy, but everything I learned from our experience made me want to understand what real leadership and operational thinking actually look like." The announcement didn't surprise me as much as it might have 3 years earlier. Derek's transformation from overconfident civilian instructor to thoughtful professional had been so complete that his interest in military service seemed like a natural progression. His experience of being fundamentally wrong about something important had given him the humility necessary for real learning, and his commitment to improving his understanding of excellence made him exactly the kind of person the military needed. "That's outstanding news," I told him, meaning every word. "The Navy will be fortunate to have someone who understands the difference between confidence and competence." I paused, remembering the young man who'd once lectured me about real-world driving while demonstrating that he didn't understand what real-world pressure actually meant. "Your willingness to learn from mistakes and completely change your approach when presented with new information, those are exactly the qualities that make excellent officers." As the conference wound down and attendees began making their way home, I reflected on how a simple decision to take civilian driving lessons had cascaded into changes that affected thousands of people across multiple industries. The humiliation I'd experienced in that Honda Civic had become the foundation for improvements that would benefit drivers, instructors, and communities for years to come. Marcus had called me earlier that morning to share the news that Precision Driving Academy had been selected as the pilot program for a Department of Transportation initiative to improve commercial driver training nationwide. The school that had once mocked my skills was now being held up as the gold standard for respectful, effective driver education. The transformation was so complete that Marcus sometimes seemed surprised by his own success. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the one that had occurred in my relationship with my brother. The crisis that exposed his resentment and jealousy had also provided the opportunity for us to build something better together. Our collaboration on developing the new curriculum had given us a shared project that celebrated both our strengths rather than highlighting our differences. Marcus had found a way to achieve professional recognition that enhanced rather than competed with my accomplishments. The young instructors who now worked at his school carried themselves with the quiet confidence that came from knowing they were part of something important. They understood that their job wasn't to humble difficult students, but to discover hidden capabilities and help people achieve their potential. The culture of respect and learning that had emerged from one terrible mistake had become the foundation for sustained excellence. As I drove home from the conference, using the same systematic approach that had once been derided as excessive caution, I thought about all the people whose lives had been improved because a group of driving instructors had learned to see competence in unexpected forms. The ripple effects continued to spread as other organizations adopted similar principles, recognizing that their assumptions about customer competence were often limiting their ability to provide effective assistance. The local bank had retrained their staff after realizing they'd been treating elderly customers like technological incompetence rather than people with decades of financial wisdom. The hardware store had discovered that asking customers about their project goals rather than assuming ignorance led to better outcomes for everyone involved. Derek approached me after the presentation, his expression carrying the thoughtful seriousness that had replaced his earlier arrogance. "Admiral, I wanted you to know that I've been accepted into the Naval Reserve Officer Candidate Program," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and nervousness. "I know it sounds crazy, but everything I learned from our experience made me want to understand what real leadership and operational thinking actually look like." The announcement didn't surprise me as much as it might have 3 years earlier. Derek's transformation from overconfident civilian instructor to thoughtful professional had been so complete that his interest in military service seemed like a natural progression. His experience of being fundamentally wrong about something important had given him the humility necessary for real learning, and his commitment to improving his understanding of excellence made him exactly the kind of person the military needed. "That's outstanding news," I told him, meaning every word. "The Navy will be fortunate to have someone who understands the difference between confidence and competence." I paused, remembering the young man who'd once lectured me about real-world driving while demonstrating that he didn't understand what real-world pressure actually meant. Your willingness to learn from mistakes and completely change your approach when presented with new information, those are exactly the qualities that make excellent officers. As the conference wound down and attendees began making their way home, I reflected on how a simple decision to take civilian driving lessons had cascaded into changes that affected thousands of people across multiple industries. The humiliation I'd experienced in that Honda Civic had become the foundation for improvements that would benefit drivers, instructors, and communities for years.